The air hung thick and cold, smelling of mud and rain and the fear that clung to her like a second skin. Rough hands clamped onto her arms, dragging her towards the river's edge where the murky water churned. Faces, indistinct blurs in the gray light, pressed closer, their murmurs a low, cruel tide against the drumming in her ears. They called her witch, harlot, burden, names that stripped away her identity until only the raw, quivering core of terror remained. She twisted, a desperate, futile movement against their grip, the chill of the approaching water, a promise of oblivion more terrifying than the life they sought to steal. Her lungs burned, air ragged things caught in her throat. She saw the water, dark and unforgiving, reaching for her, and in its depths, she saw the end of everything. The faces leered, righteous in their cruelty, ancestors of shadows that had haunted her short, difficult life. Alone, utterly, profoundly alone. The world narrowed to the bite of the rope already around her waist, the heavy stone they meant to tie to her feet, the slick mud beneath her bare soles. This was it. This was the judgment for simply existing, for having no one, for being weak in a world that devoured weakness. A sob tore through her, silent and lost in the sound of the river and the crowd. They were close now, the icy spray already wetting her face. She closed her eyes, bracing for the submersion, the struggle, the final, suffocating darkness. Then, a voice cut through the din, not one of the local jeers, but low, resonant, carrying the weight of authority. Step away from the woman, the hands hesitated. She dared to open her eyes, blinking rain and tears away. A figure sat astride a dark horse at the edge of the crowd, a man silhouetted against the oppressive sky. Tall, broad-shouldered, his face obscured by the brim of his hat, yet his presence commanded attention. He wore clothes that spoke of means, of distance from this muddy, provincial cruelty. The hands on her loosened fractionally, confusion rippling through the onlookers. She has broken God's law, a voice from the crowd shouted, emboldened. The man did not raise his voice, but his reply was sharp as a snapped twig. Your law, perhaps. Not mine. He dismounted with deliberate slowness, his boots sinking slightly into the mud. He walked towards them, towards her, and the crowd parted reluctantly, like water before a stone. He stopped before her, his gaze finally meeting hers. His eyes were a pale, startling blue in his weathered face, holding neither pity nor judgment, but a quiet, assessing calm. You have no one? He asked, his voice low only for her. Shame flooded her, hot and sharp, threatening to drown her as surely as the river. She could only shake her head, a small, defeated movement. He looked back at the crowd, then at the rope and stone. A muscle twitched in his jaw. I will take her, he stated, his voice carrying. A gasp went through the onlookers. Take her? To where? Someone stammered. He looked back at her, his gaze searching, then made a decision that hung in the cold air like fate itself. To my home, as my wife. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the wind and the river. Their shock was a palpable thing. Her own was a dizzying void. Wife, the stranger, the hands holding her fell away completely. She swayed, weak-kneed. He reached out a hand, not touching her, but offering a steady point in the swirling chaos. Come, he said simply. He did not wait for an answer, turning back towards his horse. Hesitantly, disbelieving, she took a step, then another, leaving the river, the stones, the cruel faces behind. They mounted the horse, his presence a solid, unfamiliar warmth behind her. He turned the animal away from the town, away from the river, towards the unseen road ahead. She did not look back. The wind whipped her hair, the horse's steady gait a stark contrast to the violent lurch of moments before. She was saved. But for what? Married in a breath, to a stranger whose name she did not know, heading towards a life she could not fathom. The fear had not gone, merely changed its shape, settling in the pit of her stomach like a cold, heavy stone. The rescuer was also a mystery, his motives hidden behind that stoic face. He had saved her from drowning in the river, but she wondered if she might yet drown in the silence and strangeness that now surrounded her. His name was Silas. His home was a sturdy, stone-built house nestled on a rise overlooking vast fields, a place that spoke of permanence and prosperity, yet felt strangely quiet, even empty. He led her inside, the transition from the harsh outside world jarring. The air within was warm, scented faintly with wood smoke and beeswax. He offered her dry clothes, simple but clean, and left her to change in a quiet room with a large, comfortable bed. He gave no instructions, asked no questions about her past, her name, the circumstances that had brought her to the riverbank. It was as if the moment at the river was the beginning and end of her history, as far as he was concerned. This lack of interrogation was a mercy, a vast, silent space in which her battered spirit could tentatively unfurl, away from the prying, condemning eyes of the town. But it was also unnerving. What did he expect? What was required of her in this sudden, inexplicable marriage? She was his wife, the word felt alien and heavy on her tongue. Yet she had no ring, no ceremony but the grim, public declaration by the riverbank. Days bled into a week. Silas was a man of routine and few words. He rose before dawn, worked his land or rode into the distant town on matters of business, returned at dusk. He ate his meals in near silence, acknowledging her presence with a brief nod or glance. He provided for her needs, food on the table, a roof over her head, safety from the world she had escaped, but offered no intimacy, no conversation beyond the practicalities of the household. Their shared space was vast and quiet, filled with unspoken things. She learned to read his moods by the set of his shoulders, the pace of his footsteps, the rare softening of his pale eyes. She learned his habits, how he liked his coffee, the rhythm of his pipe smoking on the porch in the evenings, the way his hands, large and calloused, were surprisingly gentle when handling a piece of wood or a tool. She started to find small tasks to fill her days, sweeping, dusting, tending the small kitchen garden. It was a way to feel useful, less like a burden, a small assertion of her own existence in this new, bewildering reality. Her internal world, however, remained a turmoil of gratitude, fear, and confusion. Who was this man? Why had he done this? Was it pity? A practical need? She knew he was a widower. A faded photograph on the mantelpiece showed a woman with a kind smile, a flicker of understanding. Perhaps he was lonely, seeking companionship. Or perhaps he simply could not abide the cruelty he witnessed, and acted on principle. His quiet reserve made him an enigma, a solid, unreadable wall against which her own fragile identity was still finding its shape. She was no longer the condemned woman at the river, but she was not yet Silas's wife in any meaningful sense. She was suspended between two worlds, owing her life to a man she barely knew. Her thoughts circled back to the faces at the river, their malice. Would they forget? Would they pursue her even here? The house felt like a sanctuary, but also a cage, albeit one built of stone and silence rather than mud and rope. She watched Silas, trying to decipher the mystery he presented. There were lines of sorrow around his eyes, a certain weariness in his movements when he thought he was unobserved. He carried his own burdens, she realized, hidden as carefully as her own past. This shared, unspoken weight was perhaps the first fragile thread connecting them, two damaged souls finding a precarious refuge in the vast quiet of his home. One evening, a storm raged outside, rattling the window panes and making the old house creak. The wind howled like a banshee, a sound not unlike the voices that had condemned her by the river. She sat by the fire, a book open but unread in her lap, the unease of the night seeping into her bones. Silas sat in his usual chair across the room, puffing slowly on his pipe, a silhouette against the firelight. The silence between them felt different tonight, not merely habitual, but charged with the energy of the storm and the vulnerability it evoked. Hesitantly, her voice barely a whisper against the wind, she broke the silence. "Thank you," she said. He lowered his pipe, his pale eyes meeting hers in the dim light. He didn't say, "For what?" He knew. For the life, for the safety, for the quiet refuge. He simply nodded, a small, acknowledging gesture. It was more than he had said in days. Emboldened, or perhaps simply needing to speak some truth after so much silence, she continued. They said I was worthless, a drain, that I had nothing to offer. Her voice trembled slightly, revisiting the raw pain. She expected him to turn away, to remain silent, to perhaps agree in his heart. But he didn't. He looked at her steadily, the firelight catching the lines on his face. "Worth," he said, his voice low and rough, "is not given by others. It is found within." His words were simple, direct, and struck her with the force of a physical blow. Worth found within. Not conferred, not granted, but found. It was a concept utterly alien to her, who had always been defined by lack of family, lack of means, lack of protection. He rose slowly, walked to the window, and looked out at the storm. "They fear what they do not understand," he said, not looking at her. "Or what they cannot control." He was speaking of the town, of their judgment, but also, perhaps, of something deeper. He turned back to her, a faint, almost imperceptible shift in his expression. "You survived," he stated, a simple fact. "That is worth. You are here. That is worth." It wasn't a grand declaration, no flowery words, but in the quiet sincerity of his tone, it meant everything. He saw her resilience, not just her vulnerability. He saw her, not the names they had called her. In that moment, something shifted within her. The cold stone of fear in her stomach did not vanish, but a tiny, stubborn seed of determination began to sprout beside it. She had been defined by others' cruelty, by circumstance. He was offering her the possibility of defining herself. The storm outside continued its fury, but inside, a quiet sense of peace settled over her, fragile yet real. Their connection deepened in the shared silence after his words, built not on passion or romance, but on a foundation of shared solitude, quiet respect, and his unexpected act of seeing her inherent worth. She began to see him not just as her rescuer and keeper, but as another solitary soul navigating the world's harsh currents. She noticed the subtle ways he looked out for her, ensuring the fire was lit before she woke, leaving a book he thought she might like on the table, the almost imperceptible pause when she entered a room. It was care expressed not in words, but in quiet, consistent action. The house began to feel less like a cage and more like a harbor, a place where she could slowly, tentatively, begin to rebuild, finding the worth he had told her lay within. The external world still existed, threatening and judgmental, but within these walls, with this quiet, strong man, she felt a growing sense of safety, and with it, a dawning strength. The path ahead was uncertain, but she no longer felt utterly alone walking it. The knock came sharp and insistent one afternoon, shattering the quiet rhythm of the house. Silas was out on the land, and she was alone in the kitchen, kneading dough. Her heart leaped into her throat, a cold, familiar dread seizing her. She didn't know who it could be, but a part of her recognized the aggressive cadence of the knocking as a threat. It was the sound of the outside world, the world she had fled, demanding entry. She hesitated, flour on her hands, her breath catching. The knocking came again, louder this time, followed by a man's voice, rough and demanding, calling Silas's name. It was one of the men from the riverbank. She recognized the tone, the underlying malice. He wasn't just calling for Silas. He was asserting his right to intrude, to challenge the sanctuary Silas had created. They knew where she was. The fear, dormant but not gone, surged through her. She could hide. She could pretend not to be here. But then what? This was her home now, however strange the circumstances of its becoming. This was her life, however precarious. To hide was to return to the powerlessness of the riverbank. She wiped her hands on her apron, took a deep breath, and walked to the front door. Opening it was an act of defiance, a step into the face of the judgment that had nearly killed her. Standing on the porch were 3 men from the town, their faces grim and set, eyes narrowed with suspicion and disapproval. The leader, a burly man named Elias, was the one who had held her arm tightest at the river. His gaze swept over her, cold and dismissive, before landing on the empty space behind her where Silas should have been. "Where is your husband?" Elias demanded, the word husband tasting like an insult on his tongue. "He is out," she replied, her voice steadier than she expected. It wasn't loud, but it carried the quiet authority of someone standing on their own threshold. The men exchanged looks. "We need to speak with him," Elias pressed. "About you," the implication hung heavy. She was the problem, the scandal, the thing to be judged and dealt with. Just then, Silas rode up the drive. He dismounted, his movements unhurried, his expression unreadable as he took in the scene. The men on his porch, her standing defiant in the doorway. He walked past the men as if they were stones in his path, his presence radiating a calm, solid strength that subtly shifted the balance. He stopped beside her, his shoulder brushing hers, a silent act of claiming and protection that spoke louder than any declaration. He faced the men, his pale eyes meeting Elias's challenge without flinching. "You wish to speak with me?" Silas's voice was quiet, but it cut through the tension. Elias seemed momentarily nonplussed by Silas's lack of obvious reaction. "I, Silas. About her," he said, gesturing towards her with a tilt of his head. "There are matters from her past. Things the town cannot overlook." Silas didn't react to the veiled threats. "The matters." His gaze remained steady. "Her past is her own," he stated. "And my concern is her present and future." His words were a clear boundary, a line drawn in the dust of his porch. Elias bristled. But Silas, he trailed off, perhaps intimidated by Silas's unwavering gaze, or unsure how to articulate the town's condemnation to this man who seemed immune to their judgment. "She was in need," Silas finished for him, his voice hardening slightly. "And now she is my wife, under my roof. That is all you need to know." It was a dismissal, firm and absolute. The men shuffled uncomfortably. They had come expecting to intimidate, to assert the town's right to police its members, even those Silas had claimed. They found themselves facing a quiet, unyielding force. Elias made one last attempt, a flicker of malice in his eyes. "Some fires, Silas, cannot be put out so easily. Some reputations are for those with nothing else to occupy their time," Silas finished, his voice like steel. He stepped closer to the doorway, effectively blocking their view of her, presenting a united front. "Good day, Elias." And gentlemen, he left no room for argument. Defeated, their authority undermined by his quiet resolve, the men turned and retreated down the drive, their footsteps heavy with resentment. She watched them go, the tension slowly draining from her body, leaving her trembling. She looked up at Silas, standing beside her. He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the retreating figures. The silence returned, but it was different this time. It was the silence of a shared victory, small but significant. He had faced down the judgment, the cruelty, not with violence, but with unwavering conviction and the quiet power of his presence. He hadn't asked her to explain, hadn't demanded details of her past. He had simply accepted her, defended her, claimed her place beside him. He turned then, his pale eyes meeting hers. There was no triumph in his expression, only that familiar, quiet assessment, and perhaps a hint of something else, something akin to respect. He didn't speak, but reached out, his large hand covering hers where it rested on the doorframe. It wasn't a lover's touch, but a solid, grounding connection, a silent acknowledgement of the moment and their shared stand. In that touch, in his quiet defense, she felt the last vestiges of the woman at the riverbank fall away. She was no longer defined by the cruelty inflicted upon her, but by the resilience she had found within, the worth Silas had spoken of. She had faced her accusers not with fear, but with quiet dignity, standing by the side of the man who had given her refuge. Their union, forged in crisis and built in silence, was not a fairy tale, but something perhaps stronger, a partnership born of necessity, respect, and a shared understanding of the world's harsh edges. They were two solitary souls who had found unexpected anchor in each other. The future was not guaranteed easy, the whispers might continue, but she faced it not as a victim, but as a survivor, standing tall beside the man who had seen her not for what others said she was, but for the quiet strength he recognized within. The journey from the brink of death had led her not just to safety, but to herself, her dignity reclaimed in the quiet space beside a stoic stranger who had become her unexpected future.